Welcome to She Said Homestead, the podcast that explores homesteading from a range of perspectives. We're Sage and Mickayla, two homesteaders, each with unique experiences, properties, and future goals for our homesteads. We're discussing various homesteading topics, sharing our personal experiences as women working full-time who are managing homesteads as well, and shining a light on the stories of other inspiring homesteaders.
Before we dive in, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And if you enjoy our podcast, please consider leaving a review. It really helps us grow and share these homesteading stories with even more people. Hey there guys, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Mickayla from Calico Cow Acres.
And I'm Sage from Terra Nova Acres. And we both have homesteads in Western North Carolina.
Today we are talking about the ideal garden for a brand new gardener. But before we get into the topic, why don't you tell me about your week?
This week, I have really felt the beginning of spring. So when we're recording this, yesterday was actually the first official day of spring. And so it is time for me to get my stuff together so that I don't get behind, which I'm already behind, but we're not going to talk about that. I planted out my brassicas. I set up the garden so that I fenced the chickens out, and I'm keeping a visual barrier between the animals and the plants so that they're not tempted. So I'm going to cross my fingers and see if those brassicas survive. But that felt good to get those in the ground because I had been worrying about that. They were outgrowing their soil blocks. And you guys came and paid me a visit to see the lambs and the little puppy livestock guardian dog that I have, who doesn't even look like a puppy anymore. She's so huge.
She looked like a puppy to me. Just a really big one. She's got the puppy flop.
She's almost as big as Copper, and that's terrifying.
I cannot wait to see her full grown. She's going to be so good to, lounge on in the pasture. She will be like your own little lounge chair.
She might be pretty gross. I don't know if I'm going to be lounging on her.
Just toss a blanket over her. Lean up against her. A little backrest.
There we go.
Yeah, that was really cool to meet her and the lambs. Oh my gosh. I could snuggle, especially, which I don't know which one's which. I can't remember. But the little one, I could snuggle him all day. I just wanted to hold him the rest of the day.
Rocky. Yeah, Rocky's really cute.
They're both cute. He was just, I don't know, he wanted to be held and he was enjoying sucking on all of my fingers.
Yeah, he was hungry. He was trying to get a meal out of you.
That's okay. It was worth it. Have you started any seeds this week?
Yeah, I have a list for my veggies and I have a list for my flowers. And there are things that I was supposed to start like 2.5 weeks ago that I have not at this point because I've been putting it off to try to film it, and I need to just get it done because at this point there's a whole other set of things that I need to start that I'm also late on, so it needs to get done. I need to just get over trying to film it and do it. Enough about me and what I'm behind on. How was your week?
Just a standard week in the life, getting told that we need to rent goats and have babies. You know how it goes.
The life of a 20-something female homesteader. Yeah.
Yeah. We obviously went to your house. That was probably the highlight of my week, being able to go pet babies and just walk around. And I don't know, we didn't really accomplish anything while we were there, but we had fun, right? That was the point.
We did.
And then after that, we went to Black Mountain and just kind of wandered around. We got a late lunch, early dinner for our 8-year anniversary because we didn't celebrate that last week when it actually happened. And then we came home and we had the first campfire of the season, which our season for those is really short here because it's going to get way too hot for that really soon. So that was really nice. I accomplished nothing on the homestead on Saturday, and it was a very relaxing day. I enjoyed that. And then Sunday, we got sunburnt and planted raspberries, and that took our entire day. And I am so glad that's done. They've been in those pots for literally 3 years, and they were not happy about it. So hopefully they'll actually survive and thrive for us.
So you moved here with those raspberries in pots?
I have moved those raspberries across the country multiple times. We get raspberries off of them every year. It's just like a handful. But yeah, I got them back in 2021, like
That
3
is
full years ago.
hilarious. Wow. Some well-traveled raspberries.
Yeah, and they sent off a bunch of, like they propagated themselves. So we thought we were going to be planting 4, and we ended up planting 13, 12 or 13. And there are
Wow.
at least 8 more that we have in a pot because they were really tiny. So yeah, hopefully they'll grow. We got some blueberries too from the farmer's market that we planted. Those blueberry plants are literally 6 feet tall. Like they're taller than me. Fingers crossed. I'm really excited for all the berries. I canned a bunch of ramen broth for eating in the summer, and I canned a bunch of maple syrup today. So that's pretty much all I've done this week besides computer work. I've edited a lot of things this week.
Didn't you burn your tongue on the maple syrup? Are we not talking about that?
We can talk about it. If you ever needed to know my level of sweet tooth, I am literally the type of person who, as a child, I would stick a straw in the bottle of maple syrup and just drink it as a snack. So. I'm not even kidding. That's happened on a lot of occasions, not even just once. Like, I've definitely done that as an adult, too.
Do you not feel the sugar overload in your body? Does it not make you feel terrible?
No, I love sugar.
Oh my gosh. If I did that, I would feel my body buzzing, but at the same time, I'm like insane about the way I drink coffee. So we both have our things.
I mean, I don't do it often, but yes, I was heating the maple syrup to can, and I was like, I need to taste this because I ordered it, and I ordered it in a 5-gallon, 2.5-gallon totes, and I was like, obviously we need to do a little taste test and make sure this is high quality stuff. And it was, and now I burnt my tongue. It was hot, high quality stuff.
So was that from Azure, or where did you get that?
I don't remember where I ordered it from. I don't remember the name of it. It's Vermont. It's like pure Vermont maple syrup. I ordered it because it's the cheapest way I could possibly get it, because ordering it on Azure is more expensive than just getting it at Walmart or somewhere else. Like even Costco, it was cheaper than getting the Costco. And I asked a bunch of people and they said Costco was the cheapest place to get it. And this was cheaper than Costco, ordering it in bulk. So we shouldn't have to buy syrup for like 2 years, which is nice. But it's something that's like, I always feel like I don't have it when I need it for a recipe, especially in the fall. I'm making a lot of desserts and things for holiday meals. So I just want to have it on the shelf on hand so I don't have to think about it, because when I have to go to the store just for that and I need a lot of it for something, it's like an expensive, annoying thing that I have to buy. So I just would rather buy it all at once, put it on the shelf, and not think about it for a couple of years.
Fair. Yeah, getting syrup, tapping trees for syrup is a project that I tell myself that I'm going to tackle every winter that rolls around. And then I'm not prepared for that very short window here where it's above freezing during the day and below freezing at night. Or I think most recently I looked at the equipment and I was like, do I want to drop this money right now? No. So maybe next year, but probably not.
I have a lot of taps with the tubes. You just have to get buckets if you want. I have way more than we need. So if you would like to try it out on a couple trees or a handful, you're welcome to borrow them. Like, we have so many. The thing is, here, we literally have to do it in like December or early January, because
Yep.
we have such a weird weather pattern down here, at least compared to what I'm used to in Michigan. Like, it's February when you're doing tapping. So I've done it successfully in Michigan before, and we did it at our last house in Michigan. So like, we just had a front yard silver maple, and I tapped that tree and I made I think it was like 1.5 pints of syrup. I started it really late though, to be fair. But yeah, I've done it before. I grew up doing it with my high school boyfriend's family and neighbors, and just it's like a huge thing there. So I know the process of it, but learning how to do it down here, we are on like the very, very southernmost potential border of being able to do it where we are. So I don't even know if it's possible, but we're going to keep trying. I just keep forgetting to do it around Christmas time because, Christmas.
Yeah, that's what I've noticed here too, which I'm a little bit colder than you are. I have slightly different weather patterns, but the consistent window really shows up like second half of December, first half of January is the opportunity, which I was also surprised, and it did also throw me off because I was expecting like February would be when I would do it, but yeah, it's just different with the weather patterns here. On to today's topic, which is the ideal garden setup for a beginner gardener. Let's talk a little bit first about what are the right conditions for where to put your garden and what sort of gardening method to use before we get into the really fun stuff like plants and things. Starting off with the size of your garden, if you are a new gardener, if you're a beginner gardener, it is in general a good idea to start off small, but Mickayla and myself know what it's like to not be able to do things in moderation. So I'm not going to tell you that you cannot have a big garden as a beginner gardener because that would be extremely hypocritical of me. But for those of you who can operate and function within moderation, one, what is that like? And two, something along the lines of, a 10-foot by 10-foot plot would be great to start with.
I think I have said in multiple different episodes that my first garden was like 10 by 10, 11 by 11, 12 by 12, some variation of that. But it's also like perfectly acceptable to garden in pots if you don't have a space to do an in-ground garden or space to put in raised beds. Like, I think my first garden, we built 2-foot by 2-foot little raised bed boxes. Taylor built them for me with trellises. Yeah, so you don't need like a dedicated garden space for growing things. You can just use pots if that's what you've got access to. Usually you can find free pots at Lowe's if you even want to just get like the black kind of flimsy free pots. They usually have them. They're trying to throw them out and they'll let people take them. I think that if you are actually trying to set up a garden space in like a backyard or something, 10 by 10 is a lot of space to grow plants. It might not seem like it, but when you start popping plants in there, especially if you are going to try and push the boundaries of what can fit in that space and to do companion planting and stuff, 10 by 10, you can grow a lot of stuff.
And what are those vertical towers that people like Roots and Refuge will have on their channel all the time? Garden stock? Garden something?
Green stock. They're called green stock.
Green stock. There we go. Those are also a great option, especially if you have only a little bit of space because it's vertical. And so it's all stacked and you can grow so many different kinds of things in there. The pockets are, kind of smaller. So I think it would be challenging to grow something really big like a tomato, but you can grow flowers in there. You can grow herbs in there. You can grow strawberries, nasturtiums, all kinds of fun stuff.
And they do have different sizes of them, that company specifically. So they have one that's called, I think it's like called the Leaf. So that's meant for more like greens and flowers, shallow rooted things. But they have ones with deeper pockets that are like a foot deep. So I've seen people grow like small, like baby potatoes in them. I think Jess from Roots and Refuge did like a tomato experiment last year of growing smaller tomatoes, cherry tomatoes and whatnot in them. So you can grow a lot of things if you push the limits of those. I used to have an off-brand version of one of those when we lived in the camper and we just like would keep it on our campsite picnic table or whatever. And I grew herbs and like mint and some flowers in those. I didn't really grow too many veggies, but we grew greens in them. And the next thing to consider is the conditions in which you're going to be planting in. So this can be things like the amount of sunlight that you get, what's going to be the easiest way for you to water, what's the condition of your current soil if you are planting in the ground, which direction your growing space faces for the sunlight, if anything shades that space in the summer. There are a lot of things to take into consideration and you can kind of get overwhelmed with that. I know at first I did, but as long as you have sunlight, as long as you have some sort of water, And as long as you're willing to try, that's really all you need.
A general rule of thumb is that you want at least 6 hours of sunlight for your garden space. And if it does get shade, afternoon shade is better than morning shade. So if you have the ability to work with your property and find a space that has those things, that's going to be the most ideal. But you can still have a garden if you don't meet those exact conditions. So don't let that discourage you. And then also you want to make sure that you have a way to water it. I know when I was growing in my backyard in spaces, I was glad that the hose reached it. And you can daisy chain hoses and do all kinds of crazy stuff. But if you can make your life a little bit easier by thinking about those sorts of things ahead of time, I promise you'll be grateful that you did.
Especially if you're growing on a patio or balcony or something similar where you have buildings potentially blocking where your sunlight's going to be, you're going to want to go to just Google Maps or something and literally look at which direction you are facing so that you know, like, if you're going to actually get any sunlight for your plants. That's something that I've struggled with in the past living in apartments. It was always hard to get sunlight to our plants because we, for some reason, always had a north-facing balcony, which is the worst. Things like the soil, which, I mean, we've talked about soil a ton, but if you are growing in something like the green stalk or pots, you're going to want to make sure that you are replenishing that soil at least every year, if not adding compost and whatnot, so that the plants aren't just depleting the soil and then they're not going to produce well if they're not being fed well, if that makes sense.
I feel like we should talk about, for the directionality, like what is a good direction.
Yeah.
So like south is ideal.
I guess elaborating on that. South is where the sunshine's going to come throughout the day. Like that's the pattern of the sun. So you want south, that's ideal. And then east, if you're facing east, you're getting morning sunlight. And if you're facing west, you're getting afternoon sunlight. So afternoon sunlight's going to be hotter and a little bit more harsh on your garden. That's why you said shade is better in the afternoon than in the morning. And then north, you're not going to get direct sunlight on the north side. It's going to be shaded. This is the same for windows. If you ever are planning a house, that's where your windows should go as well.
The one thing I will say is if you are growing in containers, I highly recommend making sure that they have drainage holes in the bottom or drilling drainage holes in the bottom before you plant in them. You can grow things in containers that don't have drainage holes, but you're going to have a lot more issues with there being water buildup on the bottom and then maybe even the top is still dry. I say that from experience.
Honestly, I'm going to go on the record saying this, but I think that growing in pots is harder. Like growing in pots and containers is a lot harder than it is to grow right in the ground. And that could be just my experience and my neglect of, keeping up on watering and taking care of things. But I have had much better luck growing in the ground.
I agree. I think growing in ground is much more forgiving for temperature regulation and water regulation, which are somewhat related. The times that I have grown in containers, I have forgotten to water more when it's hot, or I've forgotten to, move it if it just really is a seriously hot day and then the roots kind of get cooked. I enjoy growing in ground much more.
Yeah, so I guess take our advice for what it's worth. If you have the option to grow in the ground or at least try it, I would suggest that over pots. But if pots is all you've got, then I think it's still worth a shot. That sounded fun. It rhymed.
And if you are growing in ground, I personally think that there are 2 methods that are going to be the easiest for the beginner gardener. And that is either raised beds or growing directly in ground, no extra infrastructure, just sheet mulching. Raised beds are a little friendlier because you can source your soil, you can import soil, so you can have, exactly what you want to start off, and you're not having to work with whatever you have. You're not having to try to till or broad fork or do all these, other crazy things. You can put the beds in place or build them, DIY them if you want, or you can buy kits, whatever works best for you. And you can import that soil material, that topsoil, compost, however you want to fill it. But the one drawback of that is it is a little bit expensive. And that's one of the reasons that I haven't done it. I just haven't had the money to throw at that. And so if you don't have the finances to do that, that's totally fine. You can still garden and you can still be successful. But you might look at something like sheet mulching, where you lay down cardboard and then you put mulch on top and you let the cardboard kill the grass or the weeds that are underneath, and the mulch will hopefully hold that cardboard in place. And then you have a lovely in-ground garden space to start growing food or flowers or whatever you're looking to grow.
Yeah, and then in our last episode too, we talked about a bunch of different versions of no-dig and no-till gardens. So some of those might be more appropriate for you depending on when you're starting it, because with sheet mulching, I know that's something that you kind of want to start in advance. Like winter, you want to let it be able to sit for a while so that the soil can kind of, like the cardboard can break down and you'll be able to plant in them. That's going to depend on what your native soil looks like. Sheet mulching, for me, if I were to try to do that right now in the spring and then plant in it in like 2 months, it probably wouldn't work because I have solid clay. So it's going to depend on where you are. If you do want to do some version of that, we listed a bunch of those in our last episode, and they're all similar, but there are subtle differences to those. I think raised beds, although they are a little bit of an investment up front, you can plant in them right away, and you get to choose the soil that goes in them. So it's nice and fluffy right off the bat.
Yeah, and you're not going to deal with as much weed pressure in those raised beds as long as you have, I don't know, like 6 inches plus of material, which most raised beds are taller than that. Unless you get topsoil with a bunch of weed seeds in it, which would be really unfortunate, but possible, I suppose. But just in general, yeah, you're going to deal with less weed pressure in raised beds. And I will say, although it was an irresponsible decision, I have totally started gardens with the sheet mulching method like right at growing season. So you can do it. You're just going to fight with weeds and grass and whatever was there more than if you had set it up in the winter.
Yeah, no, it's possible. It's just not as fun of an experience to deal with.
Can confirm.
Yeah, I mean, I've done things like that. It's just not as enjoyable as letting it be prepared for a while. Also, if you want to try and keep weeds out of your raised beds, just put cardboard at the bottom of them before you fill them up. That will help at least a little bit. Something else that you can consider for starting your first garden is amendments. So the first thing that people are going to think of when you hear garden amendments is, at least in my mind, compost, because that just seems to be the most common thing. I feel like compost just kind of supercharges your garden. Like, it's just the more organic material that you can add to your garden, I think the better it's going to do. And the softer and fluffier and higher quality your garden soil is going to be. We talked about before, you can get compost at Lowe's or Home Depot or your local garden center or Walmart or wherever. You could get it from a local mulch place, like bulk, like I have. But if you have a 10 by 10 garden or you're growing in pots, you're probably going to want to get it on a smaller scale. Usually when I get like soil for the garden, I guess if I were putting it in pots or a green stalk or something, I probably wouldn't buy soil, like garden soil or potting soil and compost, but that's just me. What about you? Do you usually add compost on top of that at first?
If I'm growing in containers, I am getting what is either labeled as potting mix or a container mix. And the first year that I grow in that, I don't find that I need to add to that.
Yep.
But if I'm growing in ground, then I'm definitely finding some way to add compost to it. If I'm really working on a stretched budget, then I might look at turning that compost into compost tea, something like that, to get it to go a little farther. But that is another step. And if you're just getting into it, you don't need to worry about that. But if you find it interesting, you should look into it.
I feel like this is another good plug for worm farms. If you want to do
Definitely.
like the whole process all at once, get going on it, worm farms are a really, really, really good, very easy and very cheap way to add compost to your garden, add organic matter to your garden.
And a great way to deal with your food scraps without having to have a whole huge compost pile, because it can be difficult if you're working on a small scale to find enough material, because it's got to be 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, or 3 yards by 3 yards by 3 yards. I think it's 9 cubic feet. No, 27 cubic feet. 3 by 3 by 3.
3 by
Math
3
is
by
hard.
3. Can you imagine a 9-foot
really...
tall compost pile?
No. But that's really the recommended size, minimum size for a compost pile, which when I was in an apartment, I couldn't do that. And so it was a lot easier to throw some worms in a bin with some food scraps and shredded newspaper. And my plants loved that.
Yeah. And honestly, it kind of like, it involves you in the process more. It's fun to do. It's like you get to go feed your worms every day. Like 2 totes or whatever you're using is so much cheaper to buy than the compost tumblers or like the apartment or, small scale compost things. Those things are really expensive. So I think, in my opinion, the worm farm's the better option.
Plus, then you get to tell people that you have hundreds of pets, and then they give you a crazy look, and you get you get to make them really question your sanity for a minute. I always really enjoyed that.
Another really popular, easy to find amendment would be wood chip mulch. And for me, the way that I use wood chips are to top my beds as mulch. Go figure. But those over time, if you leave them in place, they are going to break down and feed your soil. They're not only keeping weeds away from your garden bed so your plants can thrive, but they are feeding the soil as they break down and deteriorate into soil.
Yeah, as a beginner gardener, I really recommend investing in some sort of mulch, because it's going to make your garden a little bit more resilient. So the days that you don't have time to or forget to water, it's going to be more okay, because that mulch is going to help retain the moisture. And on the days that it's really hot and maybe you don't have time to supplemental water to help the plants deal with it, it's going to help regulate the temperature of the soil and the roots, which the tops of the plants can handle a little bit more abuse, but when the roots get hot is when the plants really start to suffer. So investing the time to apply that mulch and the money and procuring the mulch is really going to pay off for you. Promise.
This is not something that I've done in the past. I did not use mulch until I had an in-ground bed. Do you mulch your pots, or have you mulched your pots in the past?
I only grew in pots for a couple years. I tried it a little bit, and then once I graduated to growing in ground, I was like, oh, I'm not killing things anymore. I'm just gonna run with this.
Mm-hmm.
So the very limited experience that I have with container gardening, no, I did not mulch my pots. But actually, now that I'm thinking about it, my houseplants that I have, which are obviously in containers, I do try to put something on top of that, whether that's stones or, it's not like chunky wood chip mulch, but I do try to put something on top, because even those, I forget to water. All those benefits that we just talked about help with those too.
Yeah, I have nothing on top of my houseplants actually, but except for one, because my cat likes to pee in it, so I had to cut like a plastic tote lid to fit around it so I could set it in the pot so he doesn't do that. So I guess that could count as mulch. My poor fiddle leaf. So knowing now that the mulch is so beneficial for holding in moisture, I wish in the past that 2020 and 2021 and 2019 and all the previous years, Mickayla would have known that, so that I could have mulched my potted plants, because I think that would have saved me a lot of stress, because they get dried out so easily, and it just would have been better overall. So definitely try it, I think, because especially with a pot, if you don't like the mulch on there for some reason, you're like, oh, this isn't working for me, it's easy to just scrape it off the top. it's hard to do on a whole garden bed. We'll get
Yeah.
into that when I talk about my first garden.
And most home improvement stores will have lots of different kinds of mulch. And if that makes your head hurt, most of them will have cypress mulch, which is consistently the cheapest one. It can kind of be like chunky and stringy, but it'll work. It is probably the cheapest one that they have, and it's normally not dyed. So if you just want to go there and know what you're looking for, I recommend the cypress mulch.
I don't know about 2024 prices because I have not bought mulch on a small scale like that in a few years. But the last time I bought mulch, it was like $3 a bag. And those are pretty big bags. So if you have a small garden, a couple bags would probably be plenty.
I think they're 2 cubic feet each, something like that, somewhere between 2 and 3. And the last time I looked at it, which was recently, it was somewhere between $3 and $4.
Yeah, that's not bad at all. Especially if you have a small space that you're doing it in. That's like $15 max of, if you really want to mulch things well.
And one more point about the compost before I move on. I personally think that compost is better for beginner gardeners than chemical fertilizers because the nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, the NPK ratio can get really confusing when you are starting a garden. Each one of those components does different things. And for example, if you give tomatoes too much nitrogen, they might look lush and leafy and super healthy, but you might not get many tomatoes. Same with flowers. If you give those plants these specialized chemical fertilizers that are made for very specific situations, you might not get what you're looking for. And so compost is just a little bit more forgiving. It's certainly possible to still have imbalances if you have compost, depending on what it's made out of, but it is significantly easier than trying to understand the chemistry behind all of those fertilizers and the nuances between the fertilization needs of all the different plants. If you give plants compost, for the most part, they're going to be happy and healthy and productive. Moving on to plants and what in general, these are all very general rules, and if they don't work for you, I highly encourage you to break them. But speaking very generally, the first thing that I'll say is that you should grow whatever you're interested in, because if you're interested in it, that's going to make it a lot easier to start it and take care of it and see it through the season.
I will add to that, not just what you're interested in, grow what you eat. Like, if you don't like lettuce, if you don't like salads, don't grow lettuce unless you have chickens or something to feed it to, Like, if you're just going to waste the food that comes from it, then you're not going to be getting the full experience of having a garden. Now, there are exceptions to this. Like Sage said, break the rules. I grow a lot of food that I don't necessarily love to eat because I'm trying to teach myself to like to eat that food, because it's stuff that I can readily grow fresh and eat it right out of my garden. So tomatoes, onions, things like that, I like in things, but I don't necessarily like to just eat them straight up. So that's an exception to that rule. But if you're just starting out, I would definitely start with something that you like. If you like green beans, grow some green beans, things like that. Another suggestion is growing annuals over perennials or biennials. We could go probably on a deep dive into the differences in these, and we're not going to do that today. So annuals, I guess just to quickly go over this, annuals are things that you plant and then they die in the same year. They don't live year after year after year. So they're going to produce fruit for you, you're going to pick them, and then when the frost hits, they're gone. And you have to replant them next year, like tomatoes, like peppers, like green beans, things like that. And the reason for that is because, honestly, it's just simple to do that. It's the process of knowing, okay, I get this seed, it goes in the ground, it grows, I water it, I pick fruit, and then I just do it all over next year. With perennials and biennials and things like that, there's like trimming that needs to be done, and I don't know. There's a lot more that can go into those. And again, we're not going to get into that, but they can be a little bit more difficult to manage if you're just starting out.
Right. And as a beginner gardener, you're probably going to want something that you're going to see fruit or flowers from in that first year. And that's not the case with perennials or biennials. And unless you're buying some really expensive old plant and transplanting that, which you can do that if you want, you're probably not going to see fruit from blueberries or, flowers from peonies. And that's really the gist of it.
I feel like the exception to this would be if you're buying like herb starts from the store. Like if you're buying a rosemary plant or a mint plant and you're keeping that in a pot, those you really don't have to do much with, and they will just come back every year and you can harvest from them right away. So I highly recommend growing herbs right away if you can, because those things are expensive at the store. That's a good way to make a dent into your grocery budget.
And they can be difficult to start from seed. I still struggle with that, but especially if you're buying starts, it makes it easier. Yes, it's a little bit more expensive, but it's way easier. And I know for me, I still struggle with remembering where on earth I planted my perennials. Like I have peonies under my ginkgo tree, but I'm like, shoot, I didn't mark exactly where these were. And now I have to, cut the grass for this year because it's starting to grow, but I don't want to cut the peonies. And so that's another tricky thing about growing perennials or biennials. You have to remember where on earth you put them because they're under the ground in the winter. You can't see them.
Yeah, Sage and I's direct sowing struggles go further than just seeds. It's really a labeling struggle, to be clear.
Well, shoot, the last peonies I planted, I was like, I'm going to be so good. I'm going to put the labels right next to them, and I'm going to know the variety, and I'm going to know exactly where it is. And then the chickens happened, and for some reason, they thought the labels looked delicious, and they pulled them out to try to eat them, which was unsuccessful, obviously, because it's like bigger than their heads. But yeah, that immediately just turned into trash being littered across my yard. So I tried. For the record, I tried.
This goes in the unforeseen circumstances category. Be prepared for anything.
Another general rule is that for a beginner gardener who's just getting their feet wet, I would not recommend growing anything with super sensitive seasons. For example, when you hear people talk about the spring and the fall garden, the plants that really don't like the heat of summer, you have to be really exact and really careful about the timing of those. And in some circumstances, you even have to invest in infrastructure like low tunnels or agribon or greenhouse plastic, or at least I do, to have any real success growing those things. I know I still haven't had a successful broccoli harvest since I've been here, and I've tried 4 times. So maybe 5th time's the charm. But those things are just tricky in general. It's not that you're a bad gardener. It's just challenging to hit the right circumstances. And if you're up for a challenge, absolutely go for it. Again, I'm all about breaking the rules. But if you are someone who would get discouraged by those sorts of things that, even us more experienced gardeners still struggle with, then that's not necessarily where I would recommend starting.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that other than I also still am struggling to figure out the timing of brassicas, mostly because we moved and we've only been here for just over a year. So I think that's something where if you get to know your climate and your location and your weather patterns well over a few year period, you could probably feel a little bit more confident with brassicas. But also, like Jess, Roots and Refuge, as we mentioned multiple times in this episode, she put out a video like a month ago saying she still kind of struggles with brassicas, and she's been growing for years. So it really depends. And again, I encourage you to try it if you're willing to potentially not harvest anything from them. But yeah, be cautious with those.
I feel like my biggest brassica pests are chickens. It's not even what you would normally expect, but spring and fall are when I don't have my chickens in their normal pasture rotation because the grass isn't super healthy, and sometimes I specifically have them in the garden. to take care of weeds and prep the garden for me and get them off the pasture so that I can put seed on it. And so it like all it takes is 10 seconds for the perfectly wrong thing to happen. And then my flock of 20 to 30 chickens is in the brassica row and it's done for. So
Yeah, chickens are they're pretty destructive. I guess if you don't have
little
chickens,
brats sometimes.
yeah, like if you don't have chickens, this probably isn't a concern to you, but who knows? There are a lot of pests that do like brassicas in particular. So that's, we're not going to get into pests super, super deep here, but that's something you need to be aware of, that you could lose things to pests. Another thing to consider is plants with super long days to maturity. So things like pumpkins or winter squash, peppers, there are all sorts of things. Those are going to be a test of your endurance in the form of, can you continuously water them all summer? Can you keep the pests away from them all summer? Are you patient enough to wait to actually get to harvest from them? So peppers, I would say less so than things like pumpkins. Pumpkins and winter squash and things like that, those take a very, very long time to mature, and you're not going to be harvesting them until fall. Like you need those things to almost cure in the sun. You have to wait for them to fully grow, to plump up, I guess is the best way to say that. And then they need to form a really thick skin because that's how they store themselves over winter, and that's how they stay good through the winter. So something like that, you're going to have to have a lot of patience for. I highly actually personally recommend doing peppers if that's something that you enjoy, like jalapenos, easy things like that. But there's still a waiting period there. For me, I start getting those earlier in the summer, but I know in cooler climates that's not the case. You might have to wait for most of your growing season. And that also kind of depends on if you're starting things from seed or if you're getting starts. So there's a lot of variables there.
I think last year was the first year that I was really successful or starting to be successful with pumpkins and winter squash and things like that. Part of that is because I've changed garden spaces, and so there's just been different things to contend with and different ways that I've had to adjust and get the soil to a healthier place. But again, I as a more experienced gardener, still struggle with those things, and peppers too. The soil here just doesn't have what the peppers really need to love life. And so I grow very stunted peppers, but I still grow them because it's that or nothing.
Okay, so my first garden, like I mentioned earlier, was Taylor built me two 2-foot by 2-foot raised beds that we put on our apartment balcony, and they had little trellises on the back of them, and I had pots all over our balcony. Our balcony was like a 4-foot by maybe 8-foot balcony. Like it was tiny, and we shared it with, I think, 6 other roommates. So there was not very much space there. We had a lot of plants. I did tomatoes. What are those tomato hanging things called? Like they're upside down tomato plants.
I don't know. But I know what you're talking about, but I have no idea what they're called.
Topsy-turvy, that's what they're called. Okay, so yeah, we had a topsy-turvy that I had gotten at like a garage sale or something. So I tried that out. And then we did, I think, some summer squash and zucchini and maybe beans. Just like little random stuff, a couple flowers. Honestly, I don't remember that garden very well because it was so long ago. Like that was maybe 2016 or 2017. And then every year after that until 2021, we were moving apartments and stuff. So I just had pots on our balconies. In Charlotte, we had pots on our balconies, and I mostly just grew peppers and herbs in those. And honestly, for what it's worth, I grew them fairly well. Like for how bad I am about remembering to water things, I grew some peppers. 2021, we did our first in-ground garden when we lived with our friend Adam, because he had a triangular garden space that his ex-girlfriend had turned into a garden, and then she moved out and it just got neglected. So I completely overhauled that whole thing. I planted sunflowers in it. I planted echinacea, like all sorts of flowers, cosmos. I did beans, strawberries. There's so many things. I just was like, I'm going to plant as much as I'm growing out in my garden currently, but in like a 10 by 10 by 10 space, like in a triangle. And then we had a tiny little bed off the back of his garage too that I mostly just put a couple tomato plants and flowers like nasturtiums and whatnot back there, and mint. And I didn't mulch anything in that back bed. It thrived. I mulched, I guess it would be sheet mulching, but I really didn't know what I was doing at that point. I had just started watching Roots and Refuge, and I was just learning about gardening again for the first time, like since I was a kid, and using the Blue Miracle Grow row, like market style garden rows. So I got mulch from the store and I just put it right down. I didn't try and dig up anything. I didn't try to add any good soil. I don't even know if I added compost. I might have added a little bit of compost. I just spread that all out there and put the mulch on top of it. And then I also tried to direct sow. Direct sowing things in freshly laid mulch that's like getting rained on and it's digging itself into the soil is the most stressful thing. It is the worst. That like turned me off from direct sowing. That's why I don't direct sow things anymore, because I hated that, because I was like clawing mulch out of the soil to be able to direct sow things. So now I tend to only mulch with like wood chip mulch if it's a perennial bed or if I'm not direct sowing. But I grew a lot of stuff in that first garden. I learned a lot. I started seeds for the first time for that garden. I started them in cardboard egg crates, which we just put pictures up on Instagram today on our She Said Homestead Instagram, where you can see that. They worked well. I tried the little seedling bags. Hated those. They don't biodegrade like they're supposed to. Yeah, I don't know. That's the gist of it.
That sounds like a good first garden, though.
I grew a lot of stuff. We grew like 10 or 12 foot tall sunflowers. And he still has that garden. Like, he still has the coneflower and all of the other like perennial type flowers that I planted and the stuff that reseeds itself. He sends me pictures every summer. All right, so yeah, that was my first gardens. There was a lot of variations in them. What was your first garden or gardens like?
You know, I grew a couple random things here and there in containers in college, but I would say that my first real garden was when I moved out to Colorado and I was living in an apartment complex, and they had a community garden where they made you pay an exorbitant amount of money for a little plot. It was stupid, but it made me happy and I did it. And so I don't even know what the size of it was. It had to be like 3 or 4 feet by like 5 or 6 feet. It was not much space at all, but it's what we could get. And so I remember I wish I had bought compost, but I bought topsoil and put a few bags of topsoil into that bed and then raked it in and like made it all soft and even and got all excited about it. And I didn't start any seeds for it. I bought some tomato starts from, Home Depot, Lowe's, wherever. And then I direct sowed some squash, some green beans. Gosh, it's so hard to remember what was in there now. But it was those classic, really popular garden plants. And I didn't put any mulch down because I didn't know better at that time. I wish I had. It would have turned out a lot better if I did. But I would stop by and water that every morning because it's Colorado. It's really dry. And then on the days that it was particularly hot, I would stop by and water it again in the evening, all by hand, of course. And I got so little produce out of that garden. The only thing I can really remember was that I got more squash than I could reasonably eat. And I wasn't, at that time, I wasn't interested in preserving food by cutting it up and blanching it and freezing it or anything like that. So I was just like trying to give away handfuls of squash to anybody who wanted it. That was my first garden. And then after that, every year it got bigger and bigger. And now I have like a 1/4 acre garden.
It continues to get bigger and bigger.
It does. Funny how that happens.
Yeah. For me, my first gardens, the majority of them anyway, were I don't really necessarily remember if I started any seeds direct sown in like the balcony gardens, like in pots. I think I might have always got starts from the store. So pretty much the entire garden, any gardens that I had 2021 or prior to 2021 were fully from the store. So like I got seedlings, I got starts. I didn't even try to ever start a seed or realize that you could start seeds until 2021. That's like when I got interested in it. But definitely the quintessential like tomato, pepper, green beans. I think they even sell green beans at the store, which is kind of wild to me to think about. But like herbs, mint, anything you can buy that's gonna have a burpee sticker on it at the store. That's what my gardens consisted of to start off with. And I feel like those plants are very good initial plants to start with, because if you wanted to, or if you somehow started them with seeds and killed them, you could still go to the store and get those exact same things and still grow them in your garden.
Yeah, when I first started out, the thought of direct sowing things other than green beans was so daunting to me. You know, green beans and squash is like pretty much all I could handle, you know. Trying to start a tomato seed indoors, I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I can't do that. I'm going to kill it. And so, you know, we all start there. We all start from square one. And so there's absolutely nothing wrong with buying starts at, you know, whatever store you can get them.
I guess if you're listening to this, you've probably seen pictures of mine and Sage's gardens. So you know that in just a few years, it can get extremely out of hand. And you can grow lots and lots of food like we do. So you just got to start somewhere. And I still occasionally buy starts from the store. I'm going to do that with chives because I can't seem to grow those.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, there's a handful of things that to me it's not worth it, or I know that I'm going to go through a few seed packets and it's just going to be the same price for me to buy a start from the nursery and not have to worry about it. So yeah, even now, there are things that I'm like, it's not worth it. I'm just going to buy the start.
Yeah. Azure Standard just opened up they do seedlings. So they just opened up their seedlings for the spring. And I was browsing it earlier thinking about like which ones I want to try and get. So there are a handful they're mostly herbs and special like flavors of mint that I want to try. So there are things, and there probably always will be things that I either don't want to start myself or I'm just really bad at starting myself and I need to get them at the store. Okay, so do you want to go over a handful of, I guess, beginner veggies that we would suggest for people to start with?
Definitely. Yeah. The first one that I would say is green beans. They're relatively easy to direct sow, and you don't need any extra equipment to, you know, start the seeds indoors. And if you can get them through to production without any serious pest issues, they're relatively prolific. They'll give you a decent amount of food.
We don't have this on our list, but peas are kind of the same situation. You kind of need a trellis for those. So, you know, if you don't have a trellis situation, that could be an issue. But peas are just as easy and very similar to grow as green beans. Another one is summer squash or zucchini. These are also something that you direct sow. You plant them right out in the dirt, and you don't need any special equipment. You don't need to get a seed starting setup going to do these. They are ridiculously prolific, as Sage just said. She was trying to find people to give squash away to because they just are ridiculously prolific. So if you can get them to survive the squash bugs or the vine borers, which are a huge issue for me at least. I know that a lot of people have issues with them. If you can get them to survive, they will give you so much food. You will be giving them away. It's actually a joke that I've heard that like you don't leave your window open in the summer, because if you find yourself at a gardener's house, there will be zucchini in your car when you go to leave.
Yeah, I've heard that, especially in the South.
Yeah.
Everybody's trying to give you yellow squash. But, you know, for me, that's even another plant that I count on the pests killing that plant. It's just a matter of how much food do I get from that plant before that happens. And so I want to give that disclaimer so that you don't feel like a bad gardener because your squash plants succumb to the bugs. That is something that almost every single one of us deals with.
Yeah. And a way you can fix that too is if you just buy like an extra packet of seeds, depending on how many you're sowing, sow your initial seeds and then a couple weeks later, sow some more, because then you'll at least have the chance to get more fruit off of them and you're not losing your plants after you've only harvested once or twice.
Another one on the list that maybe not everyone would be interested in because some people aren't super fond of the texture, but I think okra is really great. It's something that you can also direct sow. You don't have to buy a start. You don't have to have seed starting equipment to do this. And I have never really had any particular pest issues with okra. It's relatively hardy and it is so prolific. It's almost too prolific. There are times that you might have to pick it more than once a day to get it, you know, on that tender okra stage that is really enjoyable to eat. And so if you're a beginner gardener and you want a hardier plant that you can get a decent amount of food off of, okra is great.
Honestly, okra is frustratingly prolific. I had way too much. I don't even really like it. I grew it for, this would be on my list for growing, for making easy flower bouquets, because it looks pretty in a bouquet. And again, it grows past that initial tiny stage where you want to eat it really quickly. And so once it gets past that point, you can use it for a bouquet and then it doesn't go to waste.
And the flowers themselves are really pretty. It's related to hibiscus, so they look like really beautiful, large, you know, tropical flowers, which is something that I didn't realize until I actually grew it. I was like, wow, that's weird.
The plants get really big too. They were like taller. They were taller than me. This is the first year I ever grew them, but they were massive. I did not expect that.
They get huge, and they tolerated my poor soil in the spot that I planted them pretty well. So, highly recommend.
This one is a fun one because a couple episodes ago we just talked about how tomatoes are very popular to pests and people. They are considered a beginner plant though, and I do think that if you pay attention to them, they are one of the most rewarding plants to grow in the garden, at least for me. I think it's really, really cool to have baskets full of these giant, like ripe, juicy, beautiful tomatoes. It's the quintessential garden plant. It's what you think of when you think of planting a garden. So a lot of people want to start with them. They do need to be started indoors, or you need to go to the store and buy starts. But like we said earlier, going to the store to buy tomato starts is really easy. Like it's one of the things that you're going to find at the store, no problem, if you want to buy starts. But they do kind of come with a high pest and disease potential. So they are very susceptible to blight if you live in a rainy area, if they don't have enough, I think, calcium in the soil. If they don't have enough something in the soil, they either get blossom end rot or they will get early blight. And there are a lot of bugs that like these plants. For me, it's the leaf-footed bugs that go after them. There are tomato hornworms, which are the nastiest looking, juicy caterpillars that you'll ever see. If you can get past that, and a lot of people, if you're growing on a small scale, you might not deal with that in mass like we do. The tomatoes are ridiculously prolific, and I think they're very tasty.
Yeah, I think blossom end rot is one of the most discouraging things, especially as a beginner gardener, because, you know, you can Google pest issues, but if you see, your tomatoes start to turn dark and kind of rot from the bottom, you're like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? And it can be kind of a complicated issue to fix because it's not even as simple as, which it would be great if it was, but it's not even as simple as a lack of calcium in the soil. It's just an inconsistent available amount of calcium in the soil. So calcium is really easily dissolved. And so if you have, it worked. And so if you have a period of weather where it's really rainy, followed by a period of weather where it's really not, even that can set it off. And so tomatoes are finicky, but they are popular and they are worth trying.
Yeah. We had somebody comment and suggest that the way they're in Alexander County, which is near us, I don't know exactly which direction. I know they're very close to us. They have very similar soil to what we have here, and the situation's very similar. And they pointed out we have a lot of broom grass growing in parts of in all of our property. And they said, put lime down in your tomato beds in January or February, and that's how you solve, or how they solve, early blight in their tomatoes, which I thought was really interesting. So we tried it this year, and we're gonna see how it works, because we did have issues with a little bit of blight, which we get a lot of rain, but usually the rain is the late blight issue that they actually succumb to the blight at that point. But I don't know, I just thought it was interesting. I was like, okay, we'll try it. We have lime, we have it to spread elsewhere anyway, because our property it needs it. So,
and another great thing to grow, whether you do or don't have tomatoes, but it's a common companion plant with tomatoes, is basil. I really haven't experienced too many pest issues with basil, maybe aphids, but it's not too prone to getting destroyed by anything, and it'll actually help keep things off of your tomatoes if you do have tomatoes.
And you can have little caprese snacks. Basil, mozzarella, and tomato. I love making pizza, like margarita pizzas. I'm hungry. Can you tell? That sounds so good.
Yeah, with I always grow like a stupid amount of basil, but I make pesto out of it, and actually something that I really enjoy making out of it is an infused olive oil, which is shelf stable, and it uses a ton of basil. It basically just concentrates that basil flavor into oil that, I would have on hand anyway, and so it's not taking up a huge amount of storage space, and I throw that in almost everything. It's delicious, and I will probably make that every year. I think this year I made twice what I made the year before, and I thought that would take me through the year, and I'm almost out of it. So
get a ways to go still. You're gonna have to triple it. Yeah, and there are also different kinds of basil. So you could do like Genovese basil, which is what Sage is talking about, or you could grow holy basil, which is also called Tulsi, and use that for tea or flower arrangements. Honestly, it just makes your garden smell really good. Like, that scent is so strong that your entire garden smells like it, and that will also help keep pests away. And then there are Thai basils. And I'm sure there are more too, like lemon and lime basils and whatnot, but Thai basil smells kind of like licorice, and I use that to make pho or Asian dishes like summer rolls and whatnot. That's one of my favorite lunches in the summertime, is summer rolls, which are like the rice paper wraps they're not deep fried though.
Right. I forgot, but I also grow ornamental basil. So there's lemon basil, which smells amazing and you could eat too. Cinnamon basil, which smells amazing and you could eat too. And then a really dark, I think it's called opal basil, but why would it be called opal if it was purple?
It's
anyway, there's a really...
It's Thai basil. Opal basil is Thai basil.
Gotcha. Whatever it is, it's a really beautiful, like super dark purple basil. So I grow at least 4 different varieties in my garden every year for different purposes.
I'd like to say I only grow 4. I think I had cinnamon, lemon, lime, a few different kinds of like the sweet basil, like Italian basil, probably 5 different Thai basils. And what is blue spice basil? It was another one. Tulsi. I grow a lot of basils. So another one is onion sets. And again, this is going to kind of depend where you are, but I think that trying onions of some sort, the earlier the better, because it's going to take you a while to kind of figure out the process for your location and your style. So onion sets are basically onion bulbs. They're like mini onion bulbs that are nice and dry, like they have a little skin on them, and they pause their growing so that you can put them back in the ground and they'll just kind of wake back up, grow their roots, and grow their leaves, and then eventually bulb out for you. So they're kind of started for you initially, and then you just kind of have to finish their growing process. Onions are amazing because they don't really have a lot of pests themselves, and if you plant them around other things, they will deter pests from those other things, kind of like the basil we mentioned. And then they also don't really have a lot of disease pressure. So I think for me, from what I've heard and what I've experienced, weeds are the kind of the nemesis of onions. They don't like to be crowded by things, and overwatering, because then they can kind of get rotted. But if you forget to water things like I do, they're perfect for you. And then if you wanted to try something that's not necessarily an onion that's going to bulb, I also highly recommend growing green onions. That's what I started with, which are bunching onions is what you'll see them called. The way that I started them was I bought green onions, like a bag of green onions in the produce section at the store, and I used the green part of the onions. I chopped them so that there was like this much left at the bottom and the little roots that are on them. I planted them in the ground, and those onions are still growing at my friend's house to this day. So that's like a really like kind of free if you're already buying green onions, and they'll just kind of keep doing their thing and spreading over time. And those are easier to grow than bulbing onions because you literally plant them and they just grow their green shoots and you harvest the greens off of them repeatedly.
You can also start onions from seed, but for a beginner gardener, or unless you have a seed starting setup, I wouldn't recommend that. So it's specifically the onion sets that we recommend if you're a newbie. Just clarify that for people, because I feel like somebody out there would be like, I tried it and it was terrible.
There are a lot of different ways to do onions, and I have yet to perfect one of them. So we're just experimenting over here. It takes time. So the earlier you start, the better, because you'll figure it out sooner.
And then we also have a list of a few flowers that we recommend for newer gardeners. First one on the list is zinnias. In my opinion, zinnias are pretty easy to start from seed. You can direct sow them, and they work great in your garden as companion plants because they'll attract beneficial insects that are only going to help you out. And they really don't have much pest pressure or, many issues with diseases in my experience.
I also, not even just talking about zinnias, this is something we probably should have mentioned earlier, but if you are able to, I highly recommend growing some sort of flower with your vegetables, even if you're growing in pots, because it's going to attract pollinators. So even if it's not something where you're trying to go all flowers to do bouquets or whatever, having any sort of flower in your garden area or in a pot near your other pots of peppers or tomatoes or whatever is only going to help those thrive. Okay, another one is sunflowers, and that one was one that I grew my first year, and it really encouraged me in my gardening journey because they grow so readily. They're huge. You can harvest the seeds and actually like roast them and snack on them, which is really cool, or you can harvest them to replant, and they're just massive. If you get, I think I grew mammoth sunflowers the first year, and they're literally like bigger than my face. They're so cool. They get really tall. They don't really have any pests other than once they start to get their seeds forming towards the end of the season, squirrels and other critters will try and steal the seeds out of them, which if you're not trying to save them, that's fine. But they don't really have any disease pressure either. They just kind of grow, and they grow really well.
Another great flower to grow in your garden is cosmos. Again, it really doesn't have much disease pressure. There really aren't any pests that are going to go after it. And it can grow pretty big, and often it will self-seed itself, so it might even actually come back in the years after without you having to do much of anything. But I really like this flower. I always see bees on it when it's in my garden, and it's also a really cool cut flower to have as well.
Cosmos come in a lot of really fun colors. I like the variation in them, and I really love how whimsical they are. Their leaves and their stems are really like wavy and frilly, and they just look like they belong.
Wispy, yeah.
Yeah, they look like they belong in a fairy tale. Like they're really cool plants, and they're very easy to grow. I'm really hoping some of ours come back this year.
I'll be growing lots of cosmos and lots of zinnias in my flower space.
So the next one on this list is marigolds, and if you have read or watched anything about gardening and companion planting, you've probably heard to plant marigolds. They're very, very easy to grow, and they deter pests like crazy. So I typically plant these with my tomatoes because that's usually what I have the most pests on. So I want to like buffer those as much as I can. So lots and lots and lots of marigolds go in with my tomatoes. But they are really good companion plants for other things too. So they have low pest pressure themselves because they kind of smell weird and bugs don't like them. And they also just in general don't really have disease issues. They readily reseed themselves, and they're very easy to save seed from in the fall if you are wanting to practice that skill and save them for next year, or just let them drop their seed everywhere and replant themselves.
And if you're, a beginner gardener and you're looking at using these to companion plant, there's two ways that you can do that. You can plant it right next to another plant that you're trying to protect, or you can plant them around the border, the exterior of your garden space, so that it kind of, forms this fence, for lack of a better word, and keeps the bugs and things out. I know it even deters like deer. It's not just insects. And so they're good at their job.
And honestly, depending on what kind you get, they can be very, very pretty flowers. Some of them aren't like super stunning, but I plant a mixture of French and I don't know what the other kind is called. They're crackerjack marigolds. So they're African marigolds. French varieties are like the more well known for pest deterrence, but I think any of the varieties, I've looked into this a little bit because we've talked about this before, any of the varieties do work. And I prefer the African, more fluffy, pom-pom looking marigolds because I just think they're prettier. Those are the ones that look like they're glowing at night before the sun sets. So I just kind of do a mixture of both, and I like stagger them so that there's pest control for sure, but also it's a little bit prettier that way.
And this very last recommended flower that we have for you all is nasturtium. There is kind of an asterisk next to this one because it does not enjoy the heat. So this is more of a beginning of the garden season, end of the garden season plant. But it is also great to throw in your garden to keep pests off of your veggies or whatever else you're growing because it attracts aphids. So it acts as a trap crop for aphids, and it'll keep them off of things like your tomatoes or basil or these other things that you are probably growing because you want to eat them. But nasturtiums themselves are also edible. I don't really like to eat them. They taste kind of like gasoline to me, but people call it peppery. But the leaves are edible, the flowers are edible, all of the plant that grows above ground, at least, I don't know about the roots, is edible, and they are very pretty. There are lots of variegated varieties and lots of different kinds of nasturtiums you can get, and their flowers all look different. So they are beautiful, they are edible, and they keep the rest of your plants safer from pests.
Yeah, and I think that especially in a raised bed or even a pot situation, these flowers, they kind of like to dangle over the edge, like they drape over the edge. So if you plant them in the corner of your raised bed, they just add so much beauty to raised beds, and I guess pots too. I've never really grown them in pots, but I like to tuck them at the corners of my beds, and they're really pretty. They're really easy to save the seed, and they readily reseed just like marigolds do. But they look like lily pads, and they're really interesting. If you get them going and established before it gets too hot, or if you put them in like a shadier area, they tend to do a lot better. If you just try and plant them straight up out in the hot heat, they're not going to do as well. But if you start them ahead of time, or you find a shady corner in your raised bed, then they should do okay.
That's all we've got for you all today. And if you have any questions about starting a garden as a beginner, things that we didn't touch on, or if you want to pick our brains about tips and tricks for growing something that we didn't already talk about, please leave those down below and we'll let you know.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of She Said Homestead. We hope you enjoyed our chat. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to hear from you. Send your homesteading stories to us at shesaidhomestead@gmail.com. We can't wait to share them on the air. To stay connected, follow us on Instagram for updates and sneak peeks at what's coming up next.
If you like video podcasts, make sure you subscribe to the She Said Homestead YouTube channel too. We can't thank you enough for being part of the She Said Homestead community. Until next time, happy homesteading.